China-Australia relations, which have taken some tumultuous twists and turns over the last year, seem to be moving back on track. Are the two countries paving the way for closer ties? I'll speak with a former Australian ambassador to China to find out. And media habits are quickly changing across the world. On the 4th anniversary of Chinese President Xi Jinping calling for a convergence of Chinese media, how are news habits changing? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. After a stretch of strained encounters and icy exchanges, China-Australia relations appear to be warming up. Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull delivered a speech earlier this month saying, "We welcome China's remarkable success and we have embraced its many opportunities." The speech marks a significant change in tune from his earlier accusations that China was meddling in Australian politics and that the Australian people were standing up to China. Despite the tensions, however, the economic, cultural and strategic relationship between the two countries remains vital. China is Australia's largest trading partner. A record number of Chinese tourists visited the country last year, and waves of Chinese students are enrolling in Australian universities, and around 1.2 million Australians now claim Chinese descent. So what's next on the horizon for bilateral ties? And if we manage to walk out of the present freeze of ties, what lesson can be drawn? To sort it all out, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by former Australian ambassador to China from 2007 to 2011, Geoff Raby. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us.
Hello, Lucy.
Yeah, when Mr. Turnbull became Australia's Prime Minister in 2015, he was seen as a leader with greater understanding of the Chinese language and business connections with China, and many people was hoping that he would use his expertise to promote closer ties with China. However, it seemed that that was not what was happening. What was the reason?
It's a very complicated situation, I think. You're absolutely right. He had been involved in business in China. His son's married to a Beijing woman. He has 2 children. He himself likes to talk about his connections, his family connections, his personal connections with China. I've sold him Chinese contemporary art, and he really is very connected with China. But at the time he became Prime Minister, I think things started to change in the world order. And I think you have to understand the difficulties in the Australia-China relationship in a bigger picture. And that bigger picture is really the rise of China, China adopting a more assertive, muscular foreign policy, and then Trump, which marked a retreat by the United States, historic retreat by the United States from leading a liberal global order. And Australia has struggled ever since to find its place in that order. Yeah. And there have been some issues. There have been specific issues of some Australian politicians who have been involved with Chinese business people and have taken policy positions which have been contrary to the government's position. So it's a very mixed explanation. But basically, I think it really is Australia trying to find its position in this new world order between its security relationship with the United States and its deep, deep economic dependency with China. So between a rock and a hard place. Very much. Very much.
Let's take a look at that unfortunate event at the end of last year when Mr. Turnbull infamously said that the Australian people have now stood up against Chinese influence and meddling in Australian politics. Let's first listen to this, what Ministry of Foreign Affairs from China said, the spokesperson said upon hearing about such a speech.
We are astounded by the relevant remarks of the Australian leader. It poisons the atmosphere of the China-Australia relationship and undermines the foundation of mutual trust and bilateral cooperation. We express strong dissatisfaction.
Indeed, the relationship between the two sides were really at a very, very low point immediately following this rhetoric. Why would he say something like that? Looking back a couple of months later, does Mr. Turnbull understand what he did?
In his defence, no. In his defence, he thought he was being clever. It was in the middle of the Bennelong by-election. which has a very big ethnic Chinese population, and frankly I think he thought he was being smart. He did not understand how this would resonate in China. I don't believe he meant to cause offence, and I think ever since he's struggled with understanding that this was such an offensive remark to make in that context. But I don't think it was deliberate.
But on the other hand, China's relationship with Australia also experienced a prolonged freeze, which many say has never happened, right, in the past 46 years of diplomatic relations. Do you see any reason from the Chinese side, apart from the statement of Mr. Turnbull? Are there any other reasons that could have caused China to react so strongly?
Well, I think there's been a bunching of issues. Australia took perhaps the most strident public position on the judgment of the International Court from The Hague over the South China Sea. Julie Bishop last year made an extraordinarily silly...
Which is Australia's foreign minister. Yeah.
An extraordinarily silly speech in Singapore when she said that because China was not a democracy, it could not be a regional leader. It beggars belief why she would say something like that. And I think from the Chinese perspective, what you've seen is a bunching of specific things. I don't believe it's been coordinated by the Australian government, but rather these things have run together. And my experience in helping manage the Australia-China relationship over many years is that you can deal with differences and difficulties in the relationship, but as long as you don't have too many things running at once. And so I think a lot of this has come together, and that explains the Chinese response.
Who is making foreign policy for Australia? Is it the Prime Minister or is it the Foreign Minister? Because sometimes they don't seem to be in sync with each other.
I think that's a fair observation. It's interesting that last week when the Prime Minister made his conciliatory speech on China and trying to reset the relationship, the Foreign Minister was not even in the country. But I think on China policy, increasingly it is being run by the intelligence, defence, security establishment. And I think a lot of that's got to do with how the United States has started to vacate regional leadership, and the defence, security, intelligence establishment saying, well, we have to fill a void. So I think it is confusing, and I come back to my first comments, Liu Xin, and that is we are struggling to find how to position ourselves in a rapidly changing order.
Yeah. Well, you talked about this conciliatory message that Mr. Turnbull just gave recently. He talked at the University of New South Wales, and he really sounded much more optimistic to China-Australian relations. Let's take a listen to one paragraph of what he said.
Modern Australia is unimaginable without the talented and dynamic contribution of Australians of Chinese descent. They're a vital thread in the fabric of Australian society, the most successful multicultural society in the world. And we continue to welcome students, tourists, researchers, investors from China.
Right. So it's very good, positive message to China, but in Australia it draws some criticism and confusion as well. A lot of people do not understand why the U-turn in his apparent attitude towards China.
Well, I wouldn't describe it as a U-turn. He's trying to reset the relationship. He's giving leadership where there had been no leadership for a long time. And China is one of these relationships which is so important that only the Prime Minister can run that relationship. It's like the relationship with the United States. It really has to be run by the Prime Minister. He's now set down a framework for policy, which I think will be very helpful. But it's a reset and not a U-turn. And I see it as an act of statesmanship, and it needs to be, I think, welcomed for that reason.
Well, not everybody welcomes it. For instance, former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd wrote an opinion piece and called Mr. Turnbull's speech a grovelling mea culpa to Beijing, and said that would only make matters worse. What do you think of that?
Well, I think the language is extraordinary and frankly should not be used. I think the former Prime Minister is still dealing with the fact that the current Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, would not support him as Secretary-General of the United Nations. But statesmen have to be flexible. Statesmen have to reset the parameters of a relationship It's in the national interest. What would the former Prime Minister, Mr. Rudd, want? That the relationship continue to deteriorate? I mean, that doesn't make any sense either. So the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, has stood up and recognised that we need to reset the relationship, and I think he's done that very well.
One of the things he said is that Australia looks forward to working with China under the Belt and Road Initiative, assessing them on their merits, and where Australians conclude that these projects are consistent with Australia's objectives, standards and priorities, so then Australia can look forward to working with China. That seems to be also, if not a new turn, an adjustment to the previous position that Australia made public during Premier Li Keqiang's visit last year, saying Australia is not on board to the initiative. Why the change here? Well,
I think the reality is that the Belt and Road exists. Australian business has a very big interest in participating in it, and I think also that again it's repositioning us to understand that the world order has changed, and this is a part of the new world order, and either we are involved and we can influence it in positive directions, or we stand apart. And this is a return, if you like, to realist foreign policy. It's not ideology, it's realist foreign policy which says we have interests in this, so let's pursue our interests.
China has said that we welcome we welcome Mr. Turnbull's message, but we still want to see concrete action. We still want to see, that this is just a rhetoric to convince China. Some people are saying, if your policy is so inconsistent, you're changing from time to time, how can we trust that you will be reliable in the long term? How do you say?
Well,
how do you counter that?
It's a perfectly reasonable position for China to take, but I think that we will see that already there will be some improvement in the relationship and in terms of contact. China won't rush to Australia and embrace us, but I think gradually we'll see the relationship return in a more positive direction, and I would hope that this would lead in the near future to a visit by the Australian Foreign Minister, who has not visited China for 2 years, and that's an extraordinary state of affairs. We are utterly dependent on China economically. For the Foreign Minister not to have been here for 2 years is extraordinary, and so I would hope that the Prime Minister's speech will open the way for the Foreign Minister to come, and I hope that opens the way for the Prime Minister to visit.
What politicians say or do also reflect what they believe are the sentiments and level of understanding of the general public, and I think there is a level of misunderstanding or mistrust in the general public towards China's rise. And you wrote an article saying, entitled "How Australia Read China Better Than Australians Did." You presented an alternative future, a thought experiment which examines what the world would be like if China hadn't made certain decisions, especially around reform and opening up. And you said China could have been a big, impoverished, closed, angry, fearful and destabilizing force in the region. The region itself would have been much poorer, more fractious and much less secure and peaceful, and Australia would be much more poorer for it, while having to spend a big share of GDP on defense at the expense of education and healthcare, for example. What will China's rise mean to the people of Australia?
Well, it has given us enormous prosperity. We're in the 40th anniversary this year of the open door reform policies, and we have benefited enormously from that. And there is huge integration between the Chinese and the Australian economies. What I wrote, I stand by very firmly. I mean, it would have been a different world had Deng Xiaoping not taken China down the path that it has. And Australia's been probably one of the greatest beneficiaries of that. And so yes, I mean, we have had almost 30 years of uninterrupted economic growth, even through the global financial crisis and the Asia financial crisis in the late 90s.
Right.
Our growth rate has never weakened because we have been so deeply integrated with China.
Yeah, indeed, even during a period of low relationship, exports of goods to China, for instance, last year hit the second strongest on record.
Exactly.
And There were 1.4 million Chinese visitors last year, in the year ending February 2018. I want to ask you this question by wrapping up. Australia's former Prime Minister Tony Abbott said that Australia's relationship with China was driven by fear and greed. What do you think Australia's relationship with China should be driven by?
Oh, trust and opportunity. And I think that is the message of the Prime Minister's speech from last week. We are trying to, and he wants to get back to a situation where the relationship's based on mutual trust, and there is opportunity for both China and Australia in the relationship.
Well, indeed, we hope that things really can warm up, and we hope that there will be some concrete follow-up especially on the side of the Australian. Thank you very much, former Australian Ambassador to China, Geoff Raby, being my guest for the first part of the discussion. And you have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin, as always. We'll take a short break, but when I come back, how are different media platforms fusing and changing the news experience? I'll look at how China has been promoting the convergence of traditional and new media. Stay with me. 4 years ago today, Chinese President Xi Jinping proposed converging traditional media and new media to tap into their respective advantages. Although traditional media had been playing a crucial role in connecting individuals with the world, the days when the whole family would sit around cuddling on the sofa watching TV are starting to vanish. Instead, what we see today is everyone staring at their own phones, although they might still be sitting next to one another. The way people are exposed to information has changed tremendously with the fast development of technology. This has in turn changed the way how media outlets operate. So what exactly has President Xi's proposed convergence of traditional media and new media mean to China's media scene, and what does it mean to the general public and to media professionals like myself? Joining me for the discussion in the studio are Li Xing, Managing Director of Caixin Global, and Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Dr. Gao, let me go to you first. On August the 18th, as I said, in 2014, the Central Leading Group for Deepening Overall Reform, headed by President Xi Jinping, came up with a guideline establishing media convergence as a national strategy. The report said the principal issue for this official drive is how to build novel communication patterns through new technology and channels. What exactly does the convergence of media mean?
Well, first of all, the convergence of media is a megatrend. You either go along with it or you will be buried by it. Secondly, I think for President Xi Jinping several years ago to emphasize that the convergence of traditional media with new media is very far-sighted, because he's proposing the right strategy for the media agencies in China to do the right thing. Because as we have witnessed over the past several years, for CGTN, for example, it's not only a television station, satellite television station, it also has its own website. For example, it encourages its commentators to write op-ed to be published. So you are talking about CGTN or CCTV becoming from purely a television platform to a multimedia platform. Talking about Caixin magazine, for example, it's not just a printed magazine, it's also developing very much in a multimedia platform. And I think going forward, as you just now correctly mentioned, a smartphone can become a multimedia platform, enabling people to watch, to read, but also to transmit. Everyone now can be a radio station or a publisher, for example, or even a television station in a sense. So this is a mega trend, and China is going in the right direction.
Already this is happening, right? We're all using our phone for everything. But Ms. Li, why do you think President Xi was paying special attention to this and elevating this issue to such a height, making it a national strategy? What was the context in 2014 when he was raising this guideline? I mean, for the viewers who do not understand the mobile internet situation in China, what are the scale and the speed of development are we talking about?
Well, first of all, the penetration rate of Chinese mobile is a phenomenal appearance. Basically, everyone is using the phone, as Victor just mentioned. And also, the provider of information actually are kind of segmented, or to some extent, a little bit more siloed. We have the traditional media that is led by traditional print media and the television. And we have the what we call the new media that is more operated by the internet. portals. And then on the other hand, we also have the citizen journalist, and we also have self-media that coming along with the WeChat, which is China basically the most popular social network tool. So you have all of those. People can take up to use their cell phone to pick up the information to publish, and you turn that into thousands of self-publishers. So with that in mind, it's important to actually enable the traditional media outlets and make them make better use of the tools, and make them to have a better convergence with internet age, and use the technology to enable us to tell the story better. Because at the end of the day, integrated media still is media. Media has a mission, that is to basically bring the quality information forward.
Well, 4 years on, what have we seen as progress, and how do we measure whether we are on target, or we're ahead of the target, or we're lagging?
And I think major changes are taking place. For example, China Radio International, CCTV, and also China's Chinese language radio station are all combining together, and each of these agencies actually has its multimedia platforms. So we are talking about the 3 major government-controlled media agencies combining forces and leveraging off on each other, and not only broadcasting and transmitting throughout China, but also increasingly they are penetrating into all parts of the world. Further, I would say, coming back to your question, I think 4 years ago President Xi Jinping mentioned the importance of convergence story for media. Indeed, it is absolutely necessary, because in many cases, government-controlled media agencies sometimes can be very complacent about their role or their platform, etc. And lo and behold, if you really do not scramble and do not innovate and do not revolutionize the way you transmit, for example, then what you take for granted may be actually overtaken by other forces. And because multimedia platform now is so powerful and so efficient, sometimes false information or fake information or misleading information can be spread out very quickly. So either in order to affirmatively disseminate the right message, or try to be one step ahead of the game in terms of preventing the wrong information being spread out very quickly, the government agencies need to be very much on the proactive side and need to seize the initiative, and sometimes they even need to create the momentum rather than being dragged along by momentum.
Ms. Lee, from the point of view of a media professional, what kind of new challenges has it created for people in the media? I do not know the situation in Caixin. For instance, for me, I'm not necessarily have to appear on TV like what I'm doing now. I also have to write opinion pieces that's exclusively for the new media, and so on and so forth. That's and I have to change my way of thinking, because what people like on their mobile phone is not necessarily what other people might like on TV.
I think I see that from 2 lenses. One is from the media practitioner. Back 10 years ago, when I was sent to London to cover G20, I remember I was covered by gears. I carry a tripod, and I have a camera in front of me, and I also have a recorder to help me write the article. And I also have the laptop on my lap that I have to file live streaming to Weibo. So the life of ours has been fundamentally changed. Now we have to think about all the multiple venues. But on the other hand, for media company, we have to really rethink of our business model, because that challenges us. How do we grab people's attention? Also, what's the fundamental question is, what defines us as media that set us aside from the challenges? The challenges are very powerful. They have the money, they have the attention, they have
Who are we
traffic.
Competing against?
I think internet companies. Internet companies that set up their own platforms, that aggregate the content from various media outlets, that use better AI to basically present the information to people.
So, Victor Gao, you talked about fake news, and I think that's one of the biggest problems we're faced with in this day and age, right? In the United States, I think it goes without saying that what is fake news, who is representing, who is making fake news. In China, it's a very similar story. I mean, every day I get so much information, and even me as a media professional, it's very difficult to discern what is right, what is true, what is fake. What has this national strategy done for us in terms of better equipping us with the tools to differentiate?
Well, in China, I think sometimes fake news would involve misguided or misrepresented facts. For example, the occurrence of an earthquake, for example, or poisoning of some foodstuff. And sometimes without being verified as to their truthfulness, such information, once spread very quickly like wildfire on the internet, can really cause unnecessary panic among the people, leading to unexpected consequences. Therefore, I think from the government's perspective, they need to come up with a way to detect such misinformation very quickly, and then they also need to prevent the spread of such misguided information, and then come up with a way to clarify as to what exactly is the situation. So this is a very interactive process. On the other hand, I think it also means that if, for example, the main media agencies or the right platforms for the right information, if they do not act very quickly and very proactively, then they may be significantly weakened by the spread of the wrong media or the misguided media or the misinformation, for example. So there is a competition, and there is a need for the agencies which are in possession of the verifiable information to come up very quickly.
That's why they need to be in the picture. They need to have the capacity, the ability to do that. Ms. Lee, looking ahead, what's going to happen next in terms of the trend to converge different medias? And
I think we'll continue to explore different platforms and different tools. But one thing very important we started experimenting last year is setting up a paywall. The paywall is not necessarily a new media tool, but that gives us a very close interaction, a very close personal relationship with the readers of our consumers. I think that is, we are using all the tools you want, but we want to talk to you directly and present to you, instead of intermediaries, our quality content.
Yeah. Wow, indeed, lots of challenges, but lots of opportunities as well, and we all have a part in there. So, thank you so much for being my guest today, Li Xin, Managing Director of Caixin Global, and Victor Gao, Vice President at the Center for China and Globalization. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. I've done an okay job for bringing you verifiable information. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point, and have a good weekend.